The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Workus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. Calling all pediatricians, family physicians, and advanced practice providers, the 47th Annual Common Problems in Pediatrics Conference is coming June 3rd and 4th, 2025. The best part, 100% virtual. Get the latest updates in pediatric care, hear from top experts, and earn CME and MOC2, all from anywhere in the world. Whether you're looking to sharpen your skills or expand your professional network, this is the event you don't want to miss. Register now at aaputah.org/events. See you there. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. This is your host, Paul Workus. We're talking this month with Dr. Stephanie Spanos from the Emergency Division at Primary Children's Hospital about pediatric office emergencies. And I think you made a very convincing case last week, Stephanie, that there's a very good chance that we may be underprepared, but the hope is that we can become better prepared. Is that a safe thing to say?
Oh, absolutely. I think the simulations that we did, certainly for everyone who participated, that was proof that you can realistically resuscitate a child in the office.
And we should be able to keep our precious patients as safe and alive as possible. And those are really the stakes we're talking about here. Before we go forward, any disclosures?
No, I do not have any disclosures.
Any beefs?
No,
Sure.
I'm sure.
I know several of your partners, and they're delightful people, but I think they're beef worthy.
I do have a lot of partners with a lot of personalities. That is true.
It's a delightful division. As I mentioned last week, we're using as our point of departure the article that you wrote a couple of years ago in Pediatric Emergency Care. And just to outline this, so in 2007, the P said that we ought to be better prepared for emergencies. And you have done your level best over time. And what you've done in this article, which I would recommend highly, is talk about some findings that you had and also to make some recommendations. So today we want to go through the objectives that you talk about in this article and have you comment on those. Are you ready?
Yeah, sounds great.
It's like a speed round, but you can talk as much in depth as you want.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so objective number one is front desk early emergency recognition. What do you have to say about that?
Absolutely. So one of the things we did with the simulation was that I started as a parent with the patient, came through the door, and I went to the front desk clerk and I said, "Hi, I had an appointment for later, but I'm worried about my child. I think he's worse." And most of the time, the front desk clerk would look at me and say, "I don't know what to do." And I love that they said that, frankly, because that way we could, help. And it brought up such an important educational point that really emergency preparation for the office starts with that front desk staff. They need to look at every patient. They need to recognize an emergency. And then they need to have a system, not just of recognition, but what do I do now? Who do I alert? How do I alert? And where do we take this patient? And really, if you haven't thought about that ahead of time, it doesn't go well, but it also potentially induces a lot of panic in the office that may or may not be necessary. But when you have a system, then people respond better and you definitely provide more efficient, effective care for the patient.
So one of the things we have to take into account is not just what we're going to do once we see that patient, but take the first person who is likely to see that patient and empower them to be able to both look at the patient and also to know what to do with that patient.
Yes. And I think one of the things that came up was actually a brilliant idea from the front desk themselves, that they recognized that they had a doctor out, each day. For example, Dr. Jones wasn't there on a Wednesday. And so they developed a system where if they were nervous, then they had a way of alerting their staff, usually the medical assistant or the doctor. So instead of screaming, "I need help," and kind of getting the whole, office in a panic, but who do they first alert and how? In a calm way, how do they bring the patient back and where do they go? And they actually came up with a system of knowing what doctor was out that day. And then they would take the patient there because they knew that would be an open room. And then they had a system for who would grab the medical equipment. And it was really important for how that was stored because that way it needed to be something that somebody knew where it was, how to get it, and try to make it something efficient like a cart that then you could pull to the room that you were then in, and everyone could start taking care of the patient without it being honestly a treasure hunt of panic for the office.
So your first objective is that the front desk can recognize an emergency early within the limits of what their training is. And we hope to train them to, that they at least see everyone. And if they see something worrisome, that objective number two, that they quickly alert the medical staff for emergency help, that they know that there's a designated line of communication there. As you mentioned, it's not just start panicking, but when I'm worried about something, this is who I can call and it's going to work out.
Right. And you can just imagine. So, first, you don't want a patient to come in who, for example, the classic bronchiolitic, they're hiding in their car seat and there's a blanket over them. You don't see them. And then eventually they come back for their appointment and then somebody pulls the blanket over and realizes that child is in respiratory distress or blue, which I've been hearing that same story for many decades. It definitely happens. And so the first step is teaching that front desk clerk to eyeball every patient because you don't want to wonder, oh gosh, how long has this child been here and how long have they looked this way? I think like we talked about last time, we don't know when children fall off that curve, but man, when they do fall, it's off a cliff. And so if they potentially went off that cliff while in the elevator, you don't want them to have been in your office for over 20 minutes not being resuscitated. So when they enter your office, they are your responsibility. That front desk staff should eyeball them. And, you can train your front desk clerk about what to be concerned about or what key words a parent might say to trigger a little bit more concern. And then also you can have levels of what you do. And so is that a patient who can sit and wait? Is that a patient that maybe you want to grab the medical assistant or doctor and have them come just take a quick peek at them? Or do you need to emergently pull them back to a room? And you need to have that recognition system already established. It keeps everybody calm. That's one thing that I try to do as a doctor is how can I keep everybody as calm as possible? And the more panic, the more people don't perform well. They don't think well. They don't do their tasks well. And so anything you can do to minimize panic is key for the success of your resuscitation. And part of that also is having those roles of who do I alert? How do I alert them? Where do we go? And who's going to gather that medical equipment?
One of your great objectives that you talk about is designate a first choice for a resuscitation room rather than saying to someone, well, go over and take your seat and the doctor will be right with you. That if somebody looks worrisome, they can contact someone and you can start moving toward a space that's going to be conducive to resuscitation.
Yes, and some offices converted their procedure room into a resuscitation room, which is wonderful. And it was, beautiful. And it's definitely a special room and it's spacious and it had all the cabinets and everything was labeled and organized. And then I said, okay, so what happens if you're doing a procedure when the emergent patient comes in? So
Yeah.
again, these patients don't cooperate with exactly the right timing and staffing. You can have the perfect place to go, the ideal first desired place, but then you need to have the backup plan. And it's okay to go to one place and then maybe your plan is to move the kid out of the procedure room and then move that kid in, or it's making sure that you have portable medications and equipment and a runner to be able to gather those things for you if you have to start a resuscitation in the room that's not your first choice.
And thinking about both, can you get the equipment there, but also that we should be thinking early about EMS access was an interesting thing that you pointed out.
Yes, absolutely. There were several things that were shocking for the physicians and the staff. And I think one of the biggest ones was how often we forgot to call 911. And it just seems like something that's so automatic. And yet that was the beauty of doing simulations that you just don't realize how you're going to react to an emergency until it truly happens. And the closest that we can do to recreate that situation is the simulation. And it's great. We learned a lot on the mannequin. But one of those that was really surprising was how often 911 was forgotten. And that was a really important role that we designated to those front desk staff to say, hey, this looks bad, and interrupt the doctor in the midst of the chaos, which
Right.
they never would have done before. And then they were empowered with our team communication that the doctor said during our teaching, hey, I need you guys to interrupt me. Please interrupt me and ask me for 911. Go ahead and call 911 as early as possible, because that is extra meds, extra equipment, extra staff, and that gets your child to more definitive care faster.
One of the things that we pointed out last week that I think we'll be pointing out each of the 3 weeks, and that's that early activation of an EMS response is vital here. That what we're trying to do is decrease the amount of time that we have to rely on what we have, and involving somebody who does this all the time in a much quicker way.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think, going back to one of the things we discussed previously, and I remember as young faculty, I thought, I am the doctor. I know everything. I can do everything. And, foolishly was independent. And the older I've gotten, just the more I've realized the beauty of having teammates, other wonderful staff helping. I should not be doing everything. And in fact, in the ED, my main job is to think. I'm really not doing much unless there's a specific procedure. I stand off and I let my nurses and techs and respiratory therapists and pharmacists do all of the things.
What they do brilliantly.
What they do brilliantly, yes. But
Yeah.
then, honestly, I went into the office and I felt bad. I thought, I have so many people to help me, and look at like how hard this is. But it was so great because once we empowered the medical assistant and office managers and front desk staff, anybody who worked there to help, just being able to disperse those roles and tasks was huge. But if you do not do that ahead of time, if you don't talk about it and you don't sort out like appropriate communication and what is helpful and who can do what, and you don't practice things and teach your staff how to be helpful, because they want to be helpful. I didn't meet anybody who didn't want to be helpful. They just didn't know how to be helpful. And so that's why you've got to work this out ahead of time. And then it's just like the well-oiled machine when you actually go to do a resuscitation.
Two things that you mentioned. One was it's okay to empower the front desk staff that they don't have to get all the insurance information before we proceed with resuscitation. The thing is, they do what they do brilliantly, but I think saying it's okay. The thing that's different typically about this happening in real life and a simulation is a simulation, you're counting on this happening. And in real life, there's more chaos. And so I think that there's a great power in a front desk person saying, Dr. Spanos, would you like me to call 911? As opposed to making it seem like it's, that it's suddenly spun out of control, that it feels more like we know what we're doing here. And this person is suggesting what we usually do.
Yes, I think having everybody educated, everybody practiced, and, to your point, I had to practice with front desk staff to not do what they do so brilliantly.
Right,
So
right.
I needed them to say, okay, let's go, not do what they normally do with name, address, and insurance and demographics, but instead to just pull back into the office and start medical care. And then they can talk to the parent about that information. But part of this is muscle memory. Part of it is what you're comfortable with. You know how to do your job well, and then that's what you're going to tend to do. And unfortunately, that's not the right thing to do in an emergency. And so we have to train you for those special events.
Next objective, equipment for first 15 minutes for resuscitation should be quickly available and used. I don't know.
Yes.
Enlighten us.
Oh, boy. This is a tough one because I do think that when you look at a pediatrician and say, I need you to use your money and your time and energy and invest in buying medications and equipment for the what if moment that may or may not happen in your office. And it can be expensive. And it is a big job to purchase all these things and then to monitor them, because things do expire. And we had a variety of experiences where people knew the right thing to do, but they couldn't do it because they didn't have the right equipment, because somebody hadn't taken the time to invest in getting the right things. And the other thing that we found was that the person who had been tasked with getting the medical supplies was not necessarily medical. And so, to their credit, they did what we all naturally do, and you look for a good deal. And they would buy pieces of equipment, not realizing that they didn't fit together. And so, when the pediatrician went to do a procedure, they had all these pieces, but the pieces wouldn't fit together because the person who had purchased it, did a good job of trying to be cost conscious, but didn't recognize that you had to actually spend a certain amount of money to get the right stuff that would fit together and work at the right time. And so this really does go back to the pediatricians who have the medical knowledge to ultimately be responsible for purchasing the correct equipment and monitoring it, because pieces were brought to us that were decayed and cracking and falling apart,
Yeah.
not usable.
And that we've looked at the Lego instructions for how to put stuff together, and ideally have probably tried to do it to make sure that things fit.
Well, yes. And for example, epinephrine, the epinephrine that is required in a code requires some assembly. There are instructions on the box, and not a single person looked at the box to read the instructions, because in a panic, you can't do that. And then epinephrine wasn't given frequently to the patients because they couldn't figure out dosing. They couldn't figure out how to assemble the epinephrine for it to be administered, on top of already having to have gotten IV or IO access. And when you think, if we were sitting around a table and you just talk about what do you do for a patient, airway, breathing, circulation, it's basically good bagging and getting IV and IO access, giving IV fluids, and giving epinephrine. And it's really tricky. So if you can't do an IV and you're not comfortable with an IV or an IO and don't have the supplies ready and you haven't practiced doing the procedure, you don't know how to give the epinephrine, and you may have all these things, but you haven't practiced the, like you said, Lego assembly and doing them. If you haven't practiced and checked on your equipment, you cannot do ABCs. And I think that's what we revealed that was so great to reveal in a simulation, and the whole purpose of doing it. I think probably in addition to the EMS, like not calling 911 early, but was the oxygen tank issues. I had not foreseen this. And I don't think anybody foresaw this, but we were doing the simulations and the oxygen tank was empty, or the oxygen tank only went up to like 7 or 8 liters. And so they couldn't even get the amount of liters that they needed to do appropriate bagging. Or the tricky one that was probably the most frustrating was, I guess, some of the oxygen tanks come with a cap that require a key, and no one knew where the key was. And so you're literally looking at your treasure, this oxygen, knowing that you need to use it, but you couldn't because you didn't have a key. And usually later we'd find out that the key to the oxygen tank was in the office manager's locked office. I mean, it was like a setup of sabotage, but nobody knew it until we did the sim.
And it's not bad intentions. It's just like a practice that we haven't actually thought in terms of using the supplies. We have the supplies, but we haven't practiced using them. One of the things you point out in your article that was interesting is the whole notion of where does all this stuff go as we pull it out of the kit? Is it all over the floor? Is there a counter? How do we do that? How do we do crowd control? And have we thought through those issues?
Yeah, that was also interesting. And every office was different. Some had a specific cart. The problem is the cart was too big, and so it had to stay in the hallway. And then the doctor was annoyed because they had to keep going back and forth from the hallway to the room. But then also within the room, the counter space was sometimes too small. And so then basically the person in charge would just designate an area on the floor and just pull everything out.
Yeah.
And, to your credit, I think it's best to figure this out ahead of time and nobody's judging, and whatever gets the result in a sterile way in the end.
Right. That very little of this is a matter of intelligence or necessarily even what we're trained to do. It's practice. It's putting it into practice. It's why in all our science classes, we had a lecture and a lab, because it doesn't mean much until we practice doing it.
Well, and to the credit of practice, I have made a career out of simulation for a reason. And the hospital, so especially the emergency department that I can vouch for, we do simulations all the time. All the time. And so even though we run emergencies on patients all the time, we're also practicing all the time. And before we opened our Lehigh emergency department, we did 200 hours of simulation.
Wow.
And so people who already do this job, who prepared an ER, just like the other ER they work in, we still did 200 hours and revealed things.
Yeah.
And I just think that goes to, okay, if people who do this every day with all the meds, with all the equipment, still find the value in doing simulations all the time, then it really speaks to the importance of that level of preparation for those who don't have to do this every day, but you do not want to find yourself with a patient in front of you and should have, could have, would have taken the time and energy to prepare, and then you could have saved that life instead of not.
Yeah. And I think a lot of very smart people have at least a moderate amount of imposter syndrome, and they're just afraid of being discovered that there are things I don't know. But the point is, there is so much that I don't know, and that's okay. But I'm not going to know how to do these things unless I've practiced it. IV versus IO, that's one of your objectives.
Yes. So first of all, I guess that for people who do know what IO is, so the IV is what we're all used to. So a little needle inserted into your vein to give you fluids and medication. And then an IO is a different kind of needle, but it's intraosseous. And different IO needles come with kind of different styles and different labels to them. So it doesn't necessarily say IO, but it's a really important device because for your sickest patient, it's really difficult to get IV access. And you need to be able to deliver crucial things like IV fluids and something like epinephrine. And so your backup plan needs to be an IO. The issue for people who don't do IVs every day is that you may or may not have the supplies. You may not have them organized in a easy way. That was one thing that several offices realized was they needed to make IV start kits. So take all their IV supplies and put them together and wrap them in a rubber band or put them in a bag so you're ready to go. The IO, though, is for those who recognize that this patient is difficult IV access. I do not do IVs very often. I'm unlikely to get that IV. And then you just go to the IO, which is drilling through the skin into the bone. There are a lot of videos online. I mean, there's people who drill themselves with an IO awake just to prove the point that
Huh.
it should be that scary.
I wouldn't have to do that as a simulation, do I?
No. But I'm happy to show you videos. It is life-saving. And there are patients in the emergency department that we cannot get IV access on. And we do this every day and we have to do IO.
And if I was really good at IVs 15 years ago, should I be embarrassed if I'm not now?
Oh, no, absolutely not. No,
Right. It's a skill that stays fresh. And I think this is all built on the assumption that we're just trying to find the safest way to run an emergency.
absolutely. Even for me, I don't do IVs. I do central lines and IOs. And so I will tell you right now that if we have a mass casualty event and someone needs access and it's up to me, it's probably going to be an IO because I don't do IVs enough to place them. And we may have an event where all of my nurses and techs are doing IVs on patients. And if somebody needs something, I've got to go to what is in my wheelhouse, which at this point is doing the IO. And I think that being humble, especially as physicians, that acknowledging what is your skill set and what can you do best for this patient. And so if you're not routinely doing IVs, which I'm not, but I need to have some skill in case I need to get access on a patient. And so as a pediatrician, I don't expect you to know how to do IVs. You don't do them every day. And I think, in fact, like to your point, you're almost foolish in thinking, oh, I would get IV access. Well, how would you get IV access on the sickest kid who's ever been in your office when probably my staff who does multiple IVs a day wouldn't get access? You've got to have that backup plan. And I think that's what this comes down to is being humble and preparation of just being honest with your skill set and then what you can expect of yourself and your staff for the first like 15 minutes while you're waiting for an ambulance.
Speaking of which, your next objective is timely activation of appropriate EMS teams. And they won't get called if we don't dial, that they don't appear magically. And that needs to be part of our plan, that we recognize very early on that this is a situation that's not going to resolve quickly. We need to activate EMS.
Right. And to that point, we talk about 10 to 15 minutes, but the reality is you have listeners, I imagine, who aren't necessarily downtown with a 10 to 15 minute arrival. And especially here in the West where we don't have we don't have as many medical facilities as frequently as they may have in the Midwest and the East Coast. And so it does mean your level of preparation means something different depending on where you are. And so, like the American Academy of Pediatrics, in their statement of preparation, has said very explicitly what you need to stock and what you need to be prepared for does depend on the ambulance arrival time. Because if you are in some place that's remote and that patient is yours for an hour, then you have to have a different skill set and meds and supplies than the people who have an ambulance 10 minutes away.
And a 15-minute arrival time is time from the time of calling, not from the time that I wish they were there, right?
Right. From the time you call. And then, of course, you could have delays, traffic jams, and construction and snowstorms. And what if they are out on another call? So you're not guaranteed the fastest arrival time. And so in a compromise with the people I'm teaching is just say, okay, what do you think is your average time? But average time means it could be better or it could be worse. And so you do really need to consider, in my job, I always think worst case scenarios. So of course, the worst patient is going to come in at the worst time. It's going to be galloping through during a traffic jam.
And there are already 3 patients there, and 2 of them are moderately sick, and now 1 is very sick. So, yeah. So speaking of other things that our front desk staff can do, we should be tracking vital signs and whatnot, and we should probably appoint someone to log this, right?
Yes. So what I did with the teaching, I also built a recorder sheet, and I just love office staff. They wanted to be helpful, and it was just like, what can we do to help? And we would hand them a blank piece of paper, and that is really intimidating to say, take notes, and it's a blank piece of paper. And
Yep.
so I built a recorder sheet for them, and then that would prompt them for where to fill in the blanks, but also help them to speak up and say, hey, have we documented a heart rate? Have we documented a blood pressure? What medications are we giving? What's the dose? And it helps the staff to be able to help you more with gathering information. It helps them to prompt you for what information you haven't gotten. And then also later, when you have to make a report, which documentation these days is incredibly important, but also handing it off to EMS and the ED, you have to be able to tell them what happened, when, and how much. And recall from this chaotic, panicked moment will be really difficult, but a lot easier if you've got a piece of paper that says, oh, at this time I gave this drug and this dose. And it just also helps if you say, hey, can somebody write down all of my ideas? And then that becomes a to-do list that we check off. As opposed to during all of this chaos, I'm trying to keep track of all the things that I want to do and do dosages in my head. And I will tell you that have been simulated many times, and I am always shocked by what panic does to our ability to think and do math. And even one day I was walking down the hall trying to answer an email, and I could not walk and think and respond to this email at the same time. And there wasn't a patient dying. All you need is a patient dying, and of course, parents reacting to that. And it is really hard to think. And so we just need to practice ahead of time, because the more that you have already prepared for ahead of time, the easier this goes.
And that, I think, goes to the next objective: overcome mind blanks and task overload during an emergency. The person running the code, you would hope, would be able to distribute some of that stuff and give ownership of that stuff because we've trained it before.
Yes. And that goes back to one of the things we discussed before with CPR. So if you can have everyone in your office know how to do CPR, grab a backboard, grab a stool, and this is how you do bagging, and this is how you do the compressions. Because physically, as a doctor, if you're doing CPR, that's all you're doing. You can't do anything else. You can't think of anything else. But if you can task that to others in the office to do CPR, as long as you're coaching them and just keeping an eye on them. And the biggest thing, in addition to a good seal, we talk about bagging with a good seal, but understanding that the ambulatory bag, you have to squeeze it. People watch TV and they see a variety of things, or they just have assumptions, or they confuse different bags and devices. But one of the mistakes that I see most frequently is that the ambulatory bag, that self-inflating bag, people think that they can just hold it over the patient and it's doing something, and it's not. You have to squeeze the bag. And so just keeping an eye on your staff and making sure that they're doing it appropriately. But there's no way they can help you if you haven't trained them ahead of time and practiced.
Right. So we're fortunate in our office, one of our MAs is a CPR instructor. And so we all get to learn together. Because if you've ever seen CPR on TV, it looks a little bit more like massage therapy than like something that will help a heart to squeeze blood out. And as you mentioned, we need to be doing CPR, and that needs to be on our list of things to be thinking about, that we don't always move that to the top of the list, because again, this is such a difference from what we do day to day with our patients.
And part of it isn't just teaching and making sure it's done correctly. It's also helping your staff with doing this for real.
Yeah.
Because, and I'll tell you that I have done a lot of things on mannequins and in simulations that because I did it a lot, then it was so much easier to do it on a real patient.
Right.
And it's not, you lose that panic and you're like, okay, I know what I'm doing. I'm okay. And I'm
Yep.
going to do this. I cannot overstate the importance of panic because I have had moments in my own life where I luckily went into a simulation after vacation, but I couldn't think of anything.
Mhm.
It was just like vacation brain. And somebody who runs emergencies all the time walks in and doesn't know what to do. Like I literally looked at the staff and I was like, we need a drug. And so if you don't routinely run emergencies, you're not going to magically be able to run the emergency when it happens in your office unless you have practiced.
Which leads us to your final point, emergency protocols and staff roles. If we haven't prepared this, if we haven't practiced this, and probably if we haven't simulated this, then we're not going to be able to do it in the moment, despite our best intentions.
Oh, yeah. I think you have to actively think ahead of time of ways to overcome panic. And so, one of the biggest things is literally muscle memory. What you want to train so that when something happens, you're not thinking about it, you're not reacting to it, you're just doing what needs to be done
Uh-huh.
because you've practiced that mindset. There's just a lot with the human condition. We're not robotic. It's not like we go into emergency mode and press the button or flip the switch. Everybody just has this panic of like, oh my gosh, this is happening. And there are things that we can do to overcome that. But a lot of it's practice and preparation. When we went into these offices and people said, oh, we have meds and equipment. And then we helped them cut the tape on this new beautiful kit they had. And they opened it up and saw 85% is adult. I mean, you can imagine in the room what happens to you mentally and emotionally and physically, because I think nausea was one of them. But it's, oh my gosh, we thought we were prepared and we are not. We have 15% of what we need. And you don't want to have to go into like MacGyver mode of like, well, how am I going to take care of this patient now? I don't have what I thought I had. I don't have what I need. And if somebody had opened this kit ahead of time or done the appropriate preparation, then you could just be doing muscle memory. It's like, yep, I have what I need. This is how I put it together. This is how I resuscitate this patient. We do critical procedure practice routinely in the emergency department with like task trainers and things. And again, people who do this every day, we recognize the importance of practice. Another thing that's important is math. Coming up with a drug and coming up with the dose and doing the dosage calculation is really difficult, especially in a panic. And so ahead of time, decide what medications your office is going to have on hand and make a dosage book. And so ahead of time, having a list of the medicines in the office, that allows you in a panic to say, okay, well, what do I even have here? And that'll jog your memory. And then maybe add to it, where is it stored? So all of your office staff can help run and get it for you. Make sure you have generic name in addition to brand name, because if you name a drug, that's not necessarily how the medication is labeled. And so
Right.
they're trying to come up with, well, wait, what? Oh no, what is the actual name of that medication and how it's labeled? How can these people help me get this medicine if it's in the fridge or in some cart somewhere? And then go ahead and pre-calculate everything. So have a page that's 5 kilograms, 10 kilograms, 15 kilograms. And so You can do like a Braslo or whatever device you have in your office. And it's any type of like weight-based skill resource that then you get a weight, and then you can use your book, turn to that page, and then there it is. All of that thinking is done for you. But it took preparation.
I think your point in all of this is that sometimes what happens is, for one thing, we think, well, I used to be good at this. But I think there's also a potential sense of embarrassment to say, I feel really like completely unprepared. And the way out from that really is to come up with a plan. It's a plan, and a cooperative plan that enables us to be able to do the right thing under the right circumstances, or even
Well,
the wrong circumstances, which is what we're talking about.
it's really important. And it kind of just comes back to that humble and why we're all doing this. If a patient came in your office and had a bad outcome because you did not admit to yourself that you weren't ready, and you could have prepared, you should have prepared, you would have prepared, and a patient has a bad outcome and potentially dies because you didn't do what you could have done because of, I hate to say ego, it is much better to admit. I build most of my simulations on, like for the ED, what am I not comfortable with? Because it forces me to go,
Right.
let me read it, let me teach it, let me put everybody through our worst case scenarios to make sure that we're prepared. And it is facing those fears. And it's so great afterwards to be like, okay, now I will never miss that. And I know what to do when that kid comes in. And when the patient comes in and we've practiced it, oh, it's the best feeling, because then it's literally just like watching this amazing, magical thing happen in front of you. And you're like, that's right. We prepared, and look at this. We're saving a life. And it almost feels easy.
And part of the reason that I know that I will get this right is that I've memorialized it into a plan, and I've trained with people who are going to assist with it.
Yes. And having everyone in the office know what to do at the right time is huge. And one of the examples that people show is the pit crew. If you watch NASCAR and you watch a pit crew, they do not communicate. They have practiced so many times that they can actually change all those tires and, I don't know, oils and screws and all these things in seconds, because each person has a very specific role, very specific task. One person is hold the screw and others grab the screw and one's put it on, right? And so you want your office, and this is what we aim for with the ED, for resuscitation, it's literally like a pit crew. Everybody knows exactly what to do and how to do it, and they have the appropriate meds and equipment to do that job.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. Next week, we're going to talk about some pearls that you've learned in visiting a whole lot of offices. So we'll look forward to talking some more. Stephanie, this has been very valuable, and I think that it's very inspiring to make us want to go back and do the right thing. So thanks for your time. Thanks for your inspiration. For those of you who have questions, and I know you do, send your questions to questions@vcurb.com, and we'll deal with those in a couple of weeks. Willing to come back again next week, Stephanie?
Awesome. Thank you.
Talk to you then.
Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The virtual curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Production design and editing thanks to Phil Workus, who also composed the theme music. See you next time.